Guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for day number 4 here of the Swiss stage at Worlds 2023. It's going to be our 1-1 section of kind of this third round, so all of the teams who have both won a game and lost a game, who have yet to reach that best of 3 stage where they're at 2 in either, wins or losses, 1 away from either qualifying for the main stage or being eliminated. We're going to see some more best of 1s here today. Very excited to go over them. 4 games to cover in today's video, and basically all of them are interesting, with only really one of them kind of being a little bit predictable, at least on paper. I think everything else is at the very least interesting in one capacity or another, but I'd love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback on these games down in the comment section below. Who did you expect to win these games, and did it live up to your expectations? Were any of these games more or less interesting? Did they surprise you in any way? You know I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down below. Very quickly, I'm going to ask that if you do enjoy this video at any point throughout it, whether that's right now, if you enjoyed that fun little intro that we put together, or in 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, or by the end of the video, I really would appreciate it if you left a like on it. We put a lot of time and effort into making sure that we get these videos out each and every day, and if you enjoy the videos, if you enjoy the content, hit like and hit subscribe. It's completely free, and obviously, it really helps out the channel, so I don't want to pander to you guys too much. I don't want to waste too much of your time at the beginning of these videos, but let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate in their individual game. I'll give a player of the game and a dead of the game for each performance, and then at the end of the day, we'll quickly talk about what we can expect from day number 5, tomorrow's games, which of course are some best of 3s to see who might be eliminated from the tournament. So stick around if you're interested in that preview, but let's jump right into today's action, the day 4 games, and we got to kick off day number 4 with one of the more interesting ones, maybe not in terms of closeness, but certainly in terms of storylines and just where these two teams have been sitting. Neither have really been all that predictable over the course of this tournament up until this point. I think there are some varying opinions on how good each of these teams are. It's, of course, a battle between the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 and the number 2 seed from the LCS in Cloud9. T1 is going to be able to take this one very easily. This is a 22-minute slaughter. I'm not going to try and have any sort of pretense. This was very narrowly a perfect game if it weren't for the 2 towers that Cloud9 did end up taking throughout it. This was a disaster class from them. They made a ton of mistakes, and T1 really started to snap back into form, and I guess I don't want to say I told you so, because I'm not sure if I can kind of take credit for that, but, I put T1 as the number 3 team at this tournament coming into Worlds. I had them at number 3 in my power rankings, above teams like LNG and BLG, which I think a lot of people very much disagreed with. There was a lot of negativity, I think, just in general towards the LCK over the course of this year. Basically, even including Gen.G, people were not seeing the region as elite or in comparison to LPL, or to the LPL, mostly I think because of how MSI did end up going, and while I do identify that, I think a lot of what we've seen at this tournament is that my confidence in the LCK, relatively speaking, going into this tournament kind of has been rewarded. Now, T1 has looked a little bit not sharp, I would say, over the course of this tournament. They just narrowly get by Team Liquid in the first game of all of Worlds, and then they kind of get destroyed by Gen.G like they have been all year long, but Gen.G's a really good team. We saw that when they kind of obliterated G2 yesterday, and T1 bounced back really nicely against the Cloud9 team that, quite frankly, is good. Like, I know people aren't incredibly excited about them, and I know they're not the most flashy team in the world, and certainly they had their problems in this game and specifically in this draft phase, but, they're not pushovers. They're not a team that is just going to roll over and die, against mediocre teams. We've seen that they can beat a mediocre team. If T1 was genuinely not a top 6, 5 team in the world, then they're not going to be able to beat Cloud9 in this manner. I think it's pretty clear that they, at the very least, deserve to be in that conversation after this. But for Cloud9, this was a miserable loss. They're going to have one of these at basically every international tournament. It's just how this team operates. They do not play well from behind. They are a team that is super used to having advantages and super used to having tempo and pressure in their games. And so when they lose that, they don't really have a lot of good backup plans, and we very much saw that. But in general, I also think this draft is pretty horrendous. Let's quickly talk about that. First of all, I got to do this pretext at the beginning of every single video nowadays. Draft is important, but it's like 25 to 30% of the puzzle at most, right? You're still 70+% relying on being able to outplay your opponent. If T1 had the significantly worse draft this game, I still have plenty of confidence that they'd be able to come out and beat Cloud9 in this game. I think T1 just gave themselves more tools in the drafting phase, but more specifically, I think Cloud9 took away a lot of tools from themselves in the drafting phase. First of all, the bans are intriguing, to say the least. They took away the Caitlyn from Gumayusi, potentially, I guess, from Keria, but obviously marksman support meta is completely dead. I don't really get it at all. I do not get the Caitlyn ban. That was the first thing that really surprised me. And then obviously Renata for Keria. He's been playing a lot of enchanters. That's definitely kind of been his MO over the past month and a half, 2 months or so, including the LCK playoffs. He's really kind of shied away from the engagers. He doesn't really play Rakan or Alistar right now. Obviously he can, but he hasn't been playing it. He's been playing a lot of Lulu. He's been playing a lot of Renata. Those are the champions that he's been a lot more comfortable pulling out, so they wanted to take away that one. That one makes a little bit more sense, but then later in the draft, they do go ahead and ban the Nautilus and the Alistar, so just very confusing ideology here. We'll get into it, but the draft picks themselves, I think, are pretty poor. First of all, you know, if you know me, you know what I'm going to complain about. You know I'm going to complain about R1 Orianna. You know I don't think that that is a very good pick in the current meta. Orianna is strong. I'm not trying to dispute that. I think that there are definitely some mixed opinions about, you know, how I feel on the champion over the course of the last few videos, but Orianna is a strong champion in the meta for what she does, which is super reliably be a team fight monster. That's what she's going to do, but her lane phase is weak. She's not this perfect champion that's really good through all phases of the game, that is unpunishable, that doesn't have bad matchups that are meta right now. She's just a very consistent champion at what she is able to accomplish if she is able to get to the late game. The problem is when you R1 Orianna, it opens up the door for something like B5 Sylas for Faker, which is just a hard counter. There really is no other way to say it. Sylas is so strong into Ori. It's such a really, really strong pick to end up dealing with. It's really difficult for Ori to be able to match Sylas's pressure, not only isolated in the lane, but especially if he goes 2v2 with Jarvan. In a lot of these skirmishes, it basically is giving T1 prio in the mid game, and that's really not what you want to do against a team like T1. They're going to be really good with prio. I already talked about how good Cloud9 is from ahead and how bad they are from behind. You don't just want to hand over prio in the mid lane with a bad draft matchup like this. I know people are a lot higher and teams seem to be a lot higher on Orianna than I am. She seems to be pick or ban for a lot of these teams, and I don't agree with that. I think she's a solid pick, one of the better mid laners in the meta, but certainly not one that I would consider blindable in a lot of circumstances, and these are the games that I think kind of showcase why. Not that Eminence was the worst, but just something to keep in mind. Also prioritizing the Zeri here, going for something like the Jax as an answer to Rumble, where I think, you know, I get it, Jax can be relatively good into Rumble, but it's not like Rumble's bad at all. Honestly, I think Rumble is really good in the Jax. I think it's a really good lane matchup early for Zeus here, and he ends up taking advantage of that hard. And then for going something as aggro as Bel'Veth that really does need a lot of resources with, you know, with basically not having tempo anywhere on the map, really the only lane that I could see even remotely being a positive for Cloud9 early on is the bot lane, and that's just because Rakan can be super active. I'm not, like, super high on Zeri, but Rakan is just really good. Like, he's the best early game support in the game, really, right now, at least in terms of the priority and the playmaking that he can create, and so I could see that as a potential avenue for trying to get the Bel'Veth ahead, but you're not getting that from Ori, you're not getting that from Jax in this matchup. I just don't like this draft, and I think T1 really didn't do anything special in draft and just kind of came out on top. They drafted the Jarvan, and they drafted a couple of good lanes. They blinded Rumble and then didn't get punished, and they were able to take the Sylas into the Ori, which is really good. Obviously, Xayah on B1 is really solid. It's the best pick in the game right now, as I think me and a lot of other people have correctly identified, and then Bard is awesome. Like, Bard Gaming, that's really, really sick. Really happy for them, but player of the game is quickly going to go to Owner. What a turnaround from Owner. He needed a game like this. It had been definitely questionable from him over the past few weeks. He has not been good. He was not good when Faker left. With the wrist injuries, he, you know, when they had Poby in the mid lane, he was miserable, one of the worst junglers in the LCK. And then in the playoffs, he was just as bad. I mean, maybe not just as bad, maybe a little bit better, but his bad games were certainly just as bad, and those bad games definitely still existed. He was not good in their first 2 games at this tournament. A big problem against Gen.G, and really was not active, was certainly the worst jungler against Team Liquid as well, and so Owner was really the player on this team with the most question marks. It's really nice to see him have such a good performance against Cloud9. Now, this game couldn't have been a lot easier for him in the early game in terms of how things ended up going with just the amount of prio that was able to be created, but a lot of that prio was created by the Jarvan, so credit to him for that. And then obviously Keria is the other player that you have to shout out. Bard Gaming on the world stage, our first Bard of Worlds 2023. The champion's interesting. I actually think there's a really kind of fun niche for him in the meta right now. I don't think he was particularly, you know, phenomenal in terms of a draft pick this game, but Keria made some phenomenal plays. That bot lane dive is really an encapsulation of just how good Keria can be when he plays champions that he feels very comfortable on, like the Bard, and when he gets to play with Gumayusi and with Owner, who are playing at a high level. This was just a really consistent game. Like I said, Zeus dominated the top lane matchup. Guma and Faker were solid, but really Oner and Keria were the big playmakers this game that kind of set everything up for the rest of the team, and that's really kind of the standout thing for T1. They needed something like that. And then for Cloud9 on the other side here, this is about as bad as it goes, but again, I'm not going to say I'm entirely surprised. Cloud9 is kind of bound to have games like this internationally because of their playstyle, because of the fact that they really kind of rely on being able to take big risks and being able to kind of go toe-to-toe with their opponents in terms of micro, and if they're not able to do that, they just fall really far behind. They don't really play all that well from negative states, and this game was kind of an encapsulation of that. It really did feel like by 15 minutes they had completely given up on the game. They end up sacrificing basically their entire game just to take a tier 2 or a tier 1 tower in the bot lane because they didn't want to get perfect gamed, and they just fold over and die, right? Like, you could give dud of the game to basically anybody. Blabber did absolutely nothing on Bel'Veth, was completely inactive in the early game, and then once you fall behind on that champion, there's nothing you can do. Eminus counterpicked himself in draft by blind picking Orianna, and then had no pressure in the mid lane. Berserker and Sven were in a relatively okay spot until the mid game happened, and Sven kept dying over and over again by overextending, like he tends to do. But dud of the game for me is going to go to Fudge in the top lane. He was the one that was the most noticeable in terms of his positioning mistakes. Jax is not one of those champions that you can just, like, pick and feel good about no matter the circumstance. Fudge seems to always do this. He does this domestically, but he gets away with it because he is more talented than a lot of the other top laners in North America, but he really counterpicks himself more than almost any other top laner that I've seen in relative memory. He did it a lot at Worlds last year. He did it a lot domestically this year. I called it out in my LCS weekly reviews, but you don't get away with that against players like Zeus and against junglers like Oner. It's just not nearly as easy. And, you know, I don't want to highlight Fudge because it's not like anybody else played particularly better. He is dud of the game, but everybody really, really struggled in this one for Cloud9. But if you want to bounce back, it's certainly still possible. I see a lot of people completely giving up on Cloud9 for this. It's just one game. A best of one does not define an entire team. I hope this isn't a complete momentum and confidence killer for this team because I still think there's a lot of talent. And moving down to the 1 and 2 stage of the bracket, there are a lot of teams that they should be able to beat down there, including some Western teams that, you know, we'll get into by the end of this video. But Cloud9 is talented enough to really still make a push to, I don't know, maybe not qualify out of the Swiss stage into the bracket stage, into the quarterfinals, but certainly get into kind of the final day, the final best of 3 stage if they continue to maybe play a little bit above their level. But T1 is clearly just way better than them. This is an unfair matchup in terms of talent and in terms of skill, and they proved that. T1 completely regained their form in this one, and all the players that you needed to see step up did more than enough in this one. And then moving on to game number 2 here, and it's another Western battle, NA versus EU. I know I'm always excited for this matchups, even when there are a lot of fans that don't like one of the teams that are participating in these matchups. It's a battle between the number 1 seed from the LCS in Gen.G and the number 3 seed from the LEC in Mad Lions. I know the meme is out there that Mad just simply cannot beat a North American team, but unfortunately for them, that's going to continue here as they're going to lose to Gen.G in a crazy close game. Really, really fun one that went about 41-ish minutes back and forth. Both teams definitely stepping up and looking relatively interesting in this one. I think Mad definitely looked better against Gen.G than they did, you know, earlier on in the tournament against Cloud9. That was certainly the hope for EU fans, but still not able to get over the hump because of backdoors, baby. We love ourselves a backdoor at Worlds. We love ourselves a fun climactic ending, but this was a relatively close game between two teams that I talked about going into today, having relatively similar skill sets and being relatively similar in terms of talent levels. I thought both of these teams showed very similar things over the course of this year, neither being all that consistent, especially from a week-to-week and a game-to-game basis, but both having really high moments. And obviously, I know a lot of people are really down and really out on Mad Lions at the current moment because of their 2 losses to North America, their absolute destruction to Cloud9, where they just didn't even show up, and now they're lost to Gen.G, but this Mad team is still relatively good. You know, I'm not going to go as fully into it as I did yesterday in their game against, or 2 days ago now, in their game against BDS, where I talked about it a lot, but I see a lot of people saying about how Mad Lions is just an awful team and they didn't deserve to go to Worlds and yada, 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 and, you know, it's crazy. You know, Mad all of a sudden shuts down when they face North American and LCK and LPL teams, but they're just so good against LEC teams, and again, I'm just going to quickly reiterate the point that, not to yuck anybody's yum, LEC fans, I'm sorry if you get frustrated by these comments, but it's genuinely just because the, 4 to 8 of the LEC just isn't that strong. It's not the region that it was in 2019 anymore where you run 6 or 7 deep, right? It's, G2. G2's really good, and Fnatic's had good moments, and everybody else is just kind of meh, right? Mad's kind of meh. BDS is kind of meh, and NA is also kind of meh, but they're meh in a very similar way, and I think that's just kind of how it ends up going. With the exception of G2, I think the two regions really are pretty comparable, and I think we've seen that over the course of this tournament, and I think Gen.G proved that again in this game. I think that they were really solid in a couple of big areas, a couple of pretty big misplays, mess-ups, if you will, but they were able to get over the hump anyways. Quickly talking about draft, Mad Lions going for probably the most EU draft that they can go for, with the exception of maybe going for Ezreal in the bot lane. That's really the only thing I can think of that they didn't pick up. That's kind of the LEC special, but it feels like every single team in Europe is just infatuated with Talia as a pick, and they just want to play her every single game. Sure, she gives you prio. She's not the worst thing in the world. Jarvan's really strong right now, but they want to go for something like the Nilah in the bot lane, which I do find to be pretty intriguing. I think Nilah has a really interesting niche, and we know Carzzy can play her at a high level, and I'll be honest, the Nilah was very good in this game. This was a champion that absolutely kept Mad Lions in it. I think without Nilah and without Rumble, this game becomes a lot harder for Mad to win. Over the course of this year, the good parts of Mad were jungle mid when they were winning. Not that everybody else wasn't great, but when they started to lose, Carzzy and Hylissang kind of became the rocks of the team. Carzzy, in particular, really started to step it up in summer and in the season finals, and that seems to have carried over. This is season finals Mad Lions, if you want a good example, because Elyoya and Niski just have not been able to catch fire like they were at the beginning of the year, quite frankly, when they were fantastic both in winter and in spring. It's just not happening. And then for Gen.G, I talked about how interesting Mad Lions draft is. It's not as interesting to see what Gen.G did. I like the Jace flex into the top lane. We know Dokla can play it at a pretty high level, and it just keeps things interesting. They didn't end up getting any sort of draft advantage for that because Mad did save their mid lane pick for R5, and so you're not really surprising them by picking up the Sylas on B5, not doing, that flex pick, double flex, trying to, put them in the position that it will be utilized the best. It doesn't end up working out like that, but at the same time, I don't think anybody either won or lost draft. I think both of these teams are relatively solid, and I don't think either of them are insta wins or insta losses. I do think that if I had to say, I think that perhaps Gen.G has slightly better scaling going into the late game, almost exclusively because of Kai'Sa plus Maokai, which I just think is a very difficult duo to deal with in the late game, even though people are pretty down on both picks right now. They're still really strong, and specifically with Xayah banned in this game on red side, which I'm a big proponent of. I think banning Xayah on red side is a very good just general idea. Kai'Sa's priority is going to rise back up, and she's going to look a lot better, and that's exactly what happened. FBI was really good in this game. He's going to get my player of the game here on the Kai'Sa. I know a lot of people are really down on Kai'Sa, and people have been down on FBI all year, or LCS fans, almost said LEC fans. LCS fans have been in my comment section talking about how I overhype FBI, but all he has done is live up to expectations for this Gen.G team, and he's been, their most consistent carry, I would say, over the course of this year. You can say that Dokla and Palafox have been better carries, and I could argue that that is definitely the case. Palafox definitely has a very good argument to be their quote-unquote best carry over the course of this year, but FBI has, in my opinion, been their most consistent carry from a game-to-game basis. He just doesn't really lose all that much anymore. He struggled a bit when he first joined the team, but ever since he really found his footing with Ignar in that 2v2, he's been really solid, and this Kai'Sa took over the late game. I know that obviously she should in terms of how these teams end up interacting, but this game becomes a lot harder if FBI doesn't, win. If FBI doesn't get super far ahead and doesn't get a lot of gold, these team fights become a lot harder, and unfortunately, I am going to do kind of the rare thing of giving dud of the game to somebody on the winning team, and it's kind of unfortunate because of just how things played out, but I'm going to give it to Palafox. I know it's a weird thing to do because he essentially won the game for Gen.G, but I think in terms of individual performances over the course of this game, Mad really didn't play all that bad. There weren't any real major misplays coming in from any of their players. They just kind of got outplayed towards the back half. The Kai'Sa was the most important champion in their macro. Ended up falling apart, but Palafox, I think, had a couple of individual misplays in this game that were definitely frustrating. I don't know how, good he is on the Sylas. It's definitely one of those champions that falls into his champion pool. We know he likes to play the Akali. He likes to play some of these more melee assassin mid laners, and Sylas definitely falls into that for a lot of players, so I'm sure Palafox has a ton of experience on the champion, but he doesn't have a ton of experience on Rumble. That I can almost certainly guarantee, because some of those Rumble ultimates, man, were just bad. Like, he was missing people super consistently. I think if he had been a little bit more clinical in the mid game, this probably doesn't need to be as close as it was towards the back half, down the stretch, if you will. But it's okay. Palafox was able to right the ship, and he was able to do good in the late game. I don't really want to give anybody in this game dud of the game, because, again, I don't think anybody really made any awful performances, any awful decisions. It's not like what we just talked about with T1 Cloud9, where everybody on Cloud9 was kind of dud of the game worthy. I don't think anybody in this game was really all that dud of the game worthy. I think they were all just kind of fine, and Gen.G just ended up getting the better of it in the end. There really isn't a lot of like individual performance that I can talk about in this game. Gen.G ended up playing better. Mad Lions, I think, obviously are going to be frustrated by this. They're going to move down to the 1 and 2 part of the bracket, and there's a real chance that they could potentially draw a Western team, and we know how they are against Western teams. They beat EU and they lose to NA. It just seems to be how it ends up going, but I have faith that this team still is about as good as I expected them to be going into this tournament, which is to say somewhere around the level of Gen.G and Fnatic. I don't think there was anything in this game that really dissuaded my thoughts on that. This is basically exactly how I expected them to play. Carzzy continues to play at a high level. Chasey seems to be getting back into form at the very least a little bit compared to what he was in the season finals, where he played by far the worst league of his entire year up until this point. This team is going to rely on Elyoya and Nisqy getting back into that good state, though. Elyoya was really good on day number 2, but Nisqy just seems to have completely forgotten how to play mid lane in the last few months, and it happens. Sometimes you go through cold stretches, specifically players of Nisqy's skill set, where you just don't have the team to be able to facilitate nearly as quickly, but this was a player that was an MVP candidate in summer of last year and in winter of this year, and it just has never felt like he's regained that form over the course of this year. He's going to be the biggest difference maker between this team being a team that could potentially go to the 2-2 stage, you know, 1 series away from qualifying to get out of this group and, you know, just kind of getting destroyed in that 1-2 stage and leaving Worlds after having only beaten BDS, right? I think Nisqy's the biggest turning point for this team, so it'll be interesting to see. But for Gen.G on the other side, it's a nice win. My opinion on this team doesn't really change at all. I expected them to win this game, and they did. I think FBI and Ignar look really good. It's good to see that they have kind of continued their positive growth from the playoffs, and even if Palafox did struggle a bit in terms of some of the team fights in this game, I think in general he's been good at this tournament. Dokla's been fine. Contracts has been fine. Gen.G's a solid team. They're not overly impressive. They're probably going to be one of the weaker teams in the 2-1 side of the bracket, but they are technically now only 1 series away from making the quarterfinals at Worlds, which would be a tremendous over-accomplishment for this team. And then moving on to our third game of the day. This is the one that I kind of previewed as maybe being the least interesting on paper, but there are definitely some intriguing factors from both of these teams that could make it a lot closer than you would expect. It's a battle between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic. And Bilibili is going to be able to pick up the win here. This was expected. This is really the matchup on today's day that kind of had an expected outcome. As much as I like Fnatic, Bilibili is one of the best teams in the world, and they have been over the course of this year, even if they're not in the best form at the current moment, you know, Gen.G being their kryptonite and all, they're still a team that you cannot take lightly. And as much as Fnatic has shown some interesting things, they've certainly not shown that they can be on a team like Bilibili's level. However, they tried their best in this game. I know it doesn't necessarily look like it was entirely close, but I do think that Fnatic didn't go down without a fight, right? They at least tried to put up some resistance. They played like they wanted to win, unlike a team like Cloud9 earlier today, which just completely folded. Fnatic actually put in a really nice effort here. They were just a little bit outmatched. They just didn't exactly have the firepower to be able to compete with a team like Bilibili. But let's go ahead and quickly talk about draft. Another draft where I think both teams kind of got what they wanted to here. And ironically enough, I think both teams have some interesting points. If you're talking about advantages for Fnatic, first of all, Poppy is in a really good spot right now in terms of what is strong in the meta. It's a champion that's been banned a ton at this tournament for good reason. I think it should be one of the highest priority bans because I think the flexibility not only between top and jungle is really strong, but she does really well into basically every single meta carry in the game right now, regardless of role, including Tristana on the other side of this map, including Jax on the other side of this map. And so I like Poppy. I like the early pick Poppy. Fnatic has been very willing to go to this champion over the course of this year. I would expect a lot of other teams to follow suit. And in general, this is definitely a more comfort-oriented draft for Fnatic. Not only do they go for the Poppy in the top lane, they go for the Ivern in the jungle, which is obviously something Razork played a ton of. It was Taliyah and Ivern in the playoffs, basically exclusively, at least in the season finals. They were the 2 champions that this team qualified for Worlds with. And so I understand why they would want to go back towards it. I still like Ivern. I still think he's one of the more interesting and strong junglers in the game if you can play him proactively. And Razork was good in this game. There were a couple of good moments, and the Ivern in general is very valuable. Humanoid on the Akali, a champion that he's played a lot of over the course of his career. Maybe not as notable in 2023, but you think back to his time, you know, last year and even his time on Mad Lions and on Splice. He's always been playing Akali since the rework. It's just been a champion that he has been very, very consistent on. But really where I think a lot of the positives of this draft come out are in the bot lane. I actually think this is a great bot lane. Kai'Sa Alistar is basically untouchable if you do what I do and ban out Xayah. Xayah is really the only thing that answers this bot lane all that consistently. I think Rakan can generate a lot of momentum, and Tristana certainly is strong in the early game, but Kai'Sa Alistar, I would argue, is way stronger in the isolated 2v2, specifically when you add Ivern to the mix if you want to do a 3v3. In the bot lane, if you want to do bot side pressure, if you're Fnatic, I actually think you have a ton to be able to play off of here. We'll talk about why that didn't end up mattering as the game ends up going on, because BLG just outplayed it. But I think from a draft strategy perspective, I like what Fnatic is going for, potentially early pressure and wanting to get that Kai'Sa super fed. That is the game plan here with the Ivern, with the Poppy, a lot of tools to really help out the Kai'Sa. But for Bilibili on the other side, it's all about scaling. This is one of the hardest scaling comps that we've seen at Worlds up until this point. We've seen quite a few teams opt into wanting to play for late game team fights, but Orianna, Tristana, Jax, Sejuani, like that's pretty far in that direction if we're being entirely honest. And yeah, it does kind of work out. You do have a little bit of pressure early, but a lot of that is supposed to come from the top side of the map. I think Jax is in a relatively decent position. Typically, I'm very, not like low on Orianna B1, low on blind pick Orianna, but Akali's an Orianna favored matchup, in my opinion. I think Orianna does really well. Not that it's like crazy Ori favored. I just don't think Akali can really take advantage of Ori in the early game, and she just scales so much more consistently into the late game, and so definitely an Ori favored matchup in my eyes. Same thing with Jax into Poppy. At least early, Jax is going to be able to at least create pressure on that side. But it's never really going to be enough to change the game in the same way that I think Alistar could really mess up some of these bot lane engages if Trimby's really active. But the problem is that BLG, like I said, just outplayed Fnatic in this one. Player of the game is going to go to Elk on the Tristana. Great game from Elk. When he's, playing at the highest level, he is a top 380 carry in the world. He's just kind of right up there with anybody else, with Ruler, with Pays, with anybody else you want to put in that discussion for a top 380 carry. Gumayushi, whoever you want to be in that conversation, Elk is right there with them in terms of mechanics in particular. His ability to keep himself safe and to save all of his, protection resources, his peeling tools, his self-peeling tools, until the very last moment, whether it's on champions like Tristana or whether it's on Xayah, it's unbelievable. He basically perfectly times everything he needs to, and he's just as aggressive as he needs to be. Now, we've seen him struggle in the past when he does go up against teams that are maybe a little bit quicker on the draw than what Fnatic was in this game, but it's not like Fnatic wasn't throwing pressure at him. They were certainly trying to get on this Tristana, and Elk was just better a lot of this game. The other player that you gotta point out is obviously Bin in the top lane. These have been the two that have really kind of pushed this team over the top, on obviously in that category as well, but especially in the 3 games that this team has played at this tournament so far, it's been Bin and Elk that have really been the 2 superstars for them. Bin continuing to prove that he really is the best top laner in the world right now. Oscar actually had a really good game on the other side of this. He was probably the best performing member of Fnatic in this game, and it doesn't necessarily show in the scoreline, but the Poppy was very influential, and Bin was just too much, right? There's just no way you're going to be able to stop Bin once he starts getting out of control on a champion like Jax that really can start to take over. He is that damn good. It's just not fair. Jun and Yagao were solid enough. They didn't really have to do a whole ton, which is good because they've kind of been the more disappointing kind of duo of the team over the course of this tournament so far, but Bin, Elk, and On were phenomenal, specifically Bin and Elk really pushing BLG over the top. And then for Fnatic, like I said, Oscar I think played really well on the top side of this map. Poppy is one of those influential picks where if you're in the right spot, if you're able to team fight, you can do some good things, and the engages in general were very aggro from Fnatic. They certainly weren't going to go down without trying to make something happen in this game, and both Oscar and Trimby tried very hard to get on top of some of the backline carries for Bilibili. The problem was they were just too good, like Elk being able to buffer the peel coming in from Jun, which was phenomenal. I didn't even really talk about it, but Jun's peel was very important this game. Bin's peel was very important. On's engages were very important, and that ended up coming back to haunt a player like Trimby, who was consistently trying to look for these big Alistar engages, but the problem was that Bilibili was expecting them, and they were just peeling the Alistar off. So he would go in, try to get these big engages off. Sometimes they would work, but a lot of times they would just not, and he would go in and die, and all of a sudden your main engage from the side of Fnatic is just gone, and you don't really have a lot of tools to continue the fight. That's why Trimby is going to get my dead of the game. I don't necessarily think it's entirely his fault. I do like that he was at least looking for some of these plays, but they just didn't end up working out, especially in the critical moments down the back half of the game at some of these dragon fights. Humanoid was also pretty useless on this Akali. Not a huge fan of counterpicking yourself into Orianna when they go B1 on that, but it is what it is. I talked about it. Humanoid really likes this pick. I think that there were better options. I know the Azir on the other side was banned out, and that's been pretty consistent, but something like the Syndra is just so strong into Orianna. We've seen Humanoid not only play a ton of Syndra over the course of the season finals, but we've seen that pick do really well at Worlds. I know day number 2 kind of scared a lot of people off of it, but look at day 1 and look at the play-ins. Syndra was doing super well up until a lot of bad mid laners started playing her into good teams. It just kind of is what it is, but Syndra is still a really good pick into the Orianna, and I was very surprised to not see it in this game. I think the Akali did end up coming back to bite them, but in general, I think Fnatic tried their best. This was a game where they were a little bit overmatched in terms of, player composition, and they still went out and tried, to make a lot of these plays happen, tried to create the upset moments, and I think you do have to commend them for that. They're going to drop to 1-2, but they're really not a bad team. I view them in a very similar light to what I talked about with Cloud9 earlier. They're still going to be a major threat, and I would expect this team to not be an underdog against basically anybody in the 1-2 section. And then for Bilibili on the other side of the map, this is a nice win. You didn't really want to be in the 1-2 section if you were BLG. This is a team that made MSI Finals. They were the number 2 seed in the LPL. I know they had underperformed in a couple of series up to date, but they had only lost to Gen.G at this tournament up until this point. This is still one of the best teams in the world, and unfortunately, Fnatic was the one to draw them in this section. Bilibili moving back up into the part they should have been probably all this time, which is one series away from qualifying for the quarterfinals, and if that one series is all it takes for them to re-solidify themselves as a pretty clear top 8 team, I don't think anybody's really going to be all that surprised. And then moving on to our final game here of day number 4, and this was probably the most interesting in terms of matchups of the whole day. Not only is it a close battle, but it's a battle between two teams that I think really do want to make it out of the Swiss stage here, want to make it into the quarterfinals. We saw the number 3 seed from the LCK in KT Rolster take on the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming. And KT Rolster is going to get the job done. They're going to pick up the win here. This is what I ended up predicting in my previous video, although I did say Weibo could beat anybody, they could lose to anybody. It's really more up to them. But KT showed up. I like this KT team quite a bit. I think they're getting incredibly underrated by the community as a whole. And maybe a little selfishly, as somebody who did trust KT a lot and saw a lot of other analysts kind of put them down, it's kind of fun to see Weibo in particular go down to a team like KT, because Weibo was one of the teams that I think people were hyping up a lot more than KT and kind of putting above them in a lot of circumstances. So to see KT be able to take care of business in that regard, I think definitely is a little bit validating for some of the opinions I had at the beginning of this tournament. Also, not necessarily a braggadocious thing to say, because I don't think there's been any major upsets, but this does officially put me at 20-2 for main stage predictions so far. The only 2 games that I've gotten wrong, or 2 series, including the best of 3s that I've gotten wrong up until this point, were the 2 G2 wins on day 1 and 2 over DK and over Weibo, but this is another one that I think I'm doing pretty well on. So 20-2, continuing to look pretty good, and KT I think is a big part of that. They played really, really well. Weibo unfortunately just didn't show up here today. I think there was one player on this team who played well. Shout out Xiaohu. I think he did a really good job on the Orianna here, even though I'm still not a fan of R1 Orianna. But again, you scale really well with this team comp. You're playing for late game when you drafted, and so I can understand the direction that you might be going in. But in general, I think both drafts are relatively fine coming in from both of these teams. Both have options as you get towards the later part of the game. I think KT is a little bit more invested into trying to get the game snowballed, and luckily for them, they were able to do that. But Weibo just can reliably get in a lot of these team fights in the late game. Not only is Sivir plus Orianna one of the most dangerous 3-item duos in the entire game right now, because both of them can hard carry team fights, but you've got a ridiculous amount of setup. Jarvan plus Leona, as much as I'm low on Leona as a champion, she can offer quite a bit in terms of pairing up with someone like Jarvan, because you have a lot of that AoE area control that Jarvan naturally just sets up by existing with his knockups and with his ultimate. And then Rumble, obviously, Rumble ultimate's great. His team fighting potential, we know how good that can be. And so if you do go later in this game, that's kind of what Weibo is relying on. But KT wanted to get the ball rolling quickly, and you know what? They did that. They got the ball rolling very quickly. They basically won across the board early on in the game, and they did it in a way that I think really solidified their spot. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that this game looked basically unlosable for KT Rolster until Jat started talking, and then all of a sudden, he was getting a little bit excited. I think he even said the E word, and then KT completely throws a fight in the top lane, and that happens every once in a while. Sometimes you get a little bit too hyped about KT Rolster, and they have to bring you back down into reality, but even Jat couldn't stop KT from being able to win this one. They were just in too dominant a position, and Weibo, quite frankly, never connected to this game. Player of the game for me is going to be Aiming in the bot lane. Very quietly, Aiming and Lehens have been like a top 3 bot lane at this tournament. I don't know if they're necessarily getting talked about in that regard, but in terms of performances in all 3 games that they have played, they have won, and they have won by a lot. Even in their loss, they looked really good. This KT team definitely struggled in that game, but Aiming and Lehens were definitely the players that I think stepped up more so in that game against Bilibili, and definitely kind of held their own. And so to see them continue to look great here, I think is fantastic. I think, the takeaways obviously are that I was right to hype up this bot lane, specifically Lehens, a lot as a player. He's still my #1 support in the world, and he's done nothing but reiterate that at Worlds up until this point. But Aiming is a player that definitely has, kind of really reiterated the point that no, the breakout was not a fictional thing. He has genuinely broken out into being one of the more consistent AD carries in the world at this point, and it's really fun to see. Also, another takeaway from this game, the rumors of Kai'Sa's demise were greatly exaggerated. I know people were really talking about that yesterday and 2 days ago as well. When they were just talking about how this champion is clearly overrated and that teams need to pivot away from it. I was very much against that. What I said in those videos was, I don't think you need to pivot away from Kai'Sa. I think you need to pivot into banning Xayah on red side. I think that opens up a ton more options for what you want to play into, and that's what a lot of teams have started to do. They banned out Xayah on red side, and blue side has adapted into just first picking Kai'Sa, which I think is generally where this meta goes. If Xayah's not in the meta, Kai'Sa all of a sudden becomes a game breaker. Once again, it's really just Xayah that's stopping Kai'Sa from doing that, and aiming kind of showed that off here. Not that he didn't play well, just that Kai'Sa's obviously a really strong champion, and it's really good to get more confirmation that that continues to be the case. But everybody on KT, I think, definitely held up their end of the bargain here. Keen was really good, Cuz was really good, BDD was solid enough on the Nico. He didn't really need to do a whole ton. He was probably the player that didn't need to do a whole bunch in this game, but bot lane dominated. They were fantastic, and Cuz and Keen, I think, were definitely great facilitators here. And then for Weibo on the other side, like I said, they never really connected. 4 of the 5 members of this team, I think, had very disappointing performances in this game, and even though they did try to come back as this game went further along with their scaling, a lot of their opportunities in the mid to late game were more so created with KT mistakes rather than they were created with Weibo making good plays. I honestly think this was a pretty bad game from Weibo. Xiaohu was kind of the exception to that. I thought he played really well on the Orianna, a pick that is still incredibly solid, and if you are going to pick something like Nico, I think Nico is fine into Orianna, but it's not one of these picks that I think does really well into Ori like the Syndra that I just want to see more of. I want to see that prio continue to increase, but Nico offers more for that team fight like setup rather than carry damage level threats, burst damage, and so I understand the idea from a team composition perspective, but you're allowing this Orianna to basically go unpunished when it's drafted early, and I just don't like that idea in general. But like I said, nobody else in this team showed up. The Shy, Weiwei, Light, Crisp, they were all really bad in this game. Dud of the game is going to go to Weiwei for me. I don't think people are going to be all that surprised by that when you see how this Jarvan ended up performing. Basically, no engage ended up going well for him across this entire game, and that's about as negative of a thing that I can say about Jarvan in this current meta. We saw this champion really dominate the play-ins. He's not been nearly as dominant in the main stage. Kind of the opposite of Lee Sin, the opposite Lee Sin effect, where better players started playing Lee Sin, and all of a sudden that champion started being way more effective. Now we're seeing better players start to play Jarvan or play against Jarvan, and he's not as effective against better players. We see a lot of tempo advantages going the other way, and I think that's kind of bound to happen with a champion like Jarvan. We've seen it in the past with champions like Vi as well. You know, jungle champions that really rely on being able to generate that tempo early are just very feast or famine. They're going to have situations where they're just not quite as dominant. Now, Jarvan can be really consistent in the late game as well, especially when paired up with, you know, the Rage Cage, Orianna Rumble combo here, and Leona as well. I guess you can dump into that, but it just didn't end up working out. Weiwei's kind of been the carry for this team at this tournament up until this point, and this was not a good performance from him, and everybody else lost. Light and Crisp were awful this game, and I'm going to be honest, they've been really bad at this tournament. I don't know whether that's sustainable because they were super consistent for this team over the course of this year. Even people who were lower than me on Crisp, I know some people putting Crisp really low in their support rankings, couldn't have predicted this. I think this is definitely a surprising outcome for how this goes. I know a lot of people are complaining about his build, but this is honestly a pretty good game to buy 45 control wards, if I'm being entirely honest, against Nico, against Nautilus, you know, against Cassante. I think it's a pretty good game. Viego in that same vein, it's a pretty good game to end up doing that. Unfortunately, Light played really bad too. His positioning on the Sivir was very suspect down the stretch of this game. That champion can do a lot of damage, but it takes her quite a while to get into that state. And so to play her super aggro in the early game, it's just not the direction I personally would have gone in. Light and Crisp have been very disappointing. Light in particular in this game was definitely not it. And then the Shy was just nothing on the top side on the Rumble. When he doesn't get going in the early game, he doesn't really turn it around. He's definitely more of a snowball player. You guys know my thoughts on the Shy at this point. I don't need to go into detail on that. But in general, Weibo didn't play well at all. I know this looks like a close game, and I know that there were moments where it felt like they were getting back into it, but like I said, I think that was more KT making mistakes than anything positive I can really say about what Weibo Gaming was doing. This was a poor performance, and this is kind of more of what I expected from this team going into this tournament. I thought that they were going to be top 8, purely because I just underestimated G2, but with G2 performing really well, there's a real chance that they don't make quarterfinals. I know that that's a pretty big stretch considering the teams that are kind of going up against them, but who's to say a team like D plus Kia can't make a run? They've really only played good teams up until this point, and, you know, they could be better than Weibo. That's definitely a concern, and so if this team doesn't get their shit into high gear, they're now 1-2. They are one game away from dropping out of Worlds, and that would be a majorly disappointing run to not make quarterfinals for them. And then for KT on the other side, Nice win. I still feel like this team is undervalued. This was a really solid game. This bot lane has been incredible at this tournament. Aiming and Lehans are just not receiving the credit that they deserve. They really have been fantastic. And even though Keen struggled on day number 1, he's rebounded relatively nicely. Cuz and BDD, I think, are fine. This team has a lot of upside. Do I think that they're a Worlds winning team? Probably not. But is this a team that could shock a lot of people and make semifinals if they get the right draw in quarters? Absolutely. And this is a team that very much should be expecting to get quarters. Like we've said, for everybody who's won today, they are now officially one series away from qualifying for the quarterfinals, and I think I and a lot of other people kind of expect them to be able to do so at this point. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2023 Day 4 overview and analysis video. Our 1-1s are done. It's time to move down to the 0-2 section in the upcoming days. We know the teams that have moved to 2-1 and 1-2, at least from this point, but we've got 2 more series in this de facto 3rd round to go through before we know the teams that we're going to get drawn in the 4th round. Of course, these 0-2 matchups are very important because by the end of this, we are going to see the first 2 teams officially eliminated from Worlds Swiss stage, I guess, in 2023. It's an interesting matchup. If you want my full thoughts on these 2 series kind of going head-to-head, I did cover them at the end of day number 2 in that video. You can go ahead and check that out if you want full coverage. I'll quickly go over who I'm picking to win and why. But again, if you want a more detailed breakdown, go check out the end of that video. Starting off with DK taking on BDS. I talked about it then. I'll talk about it now. DK has underperformed at this tournament. Kellen in particular has really not looked good. Deft has not really stepped up. He's played some of the worst League that he's played all year long, and it really does feel like the rest of the map is just kind of hoping and praying that bot lane can survive. But if there's any team that DK bot lane, can rebound against and can gain their confidence back against, it's probably BDS's with how they played at this tournament. Their bot lane's been a major weakness, and BDS, in my opinion, is just not a super talented team. I think they're very lucky to be in the Swiss stage in the first place, considering their series against PSG, where I think you can make a really solid argument that they weren't even the better team in that series. PSG just greeted the games 3 and 4 drafts. But, BDS has a shot here. I just think DK should be able to win this. I would expect a 2-0. Wouldn't expect it to be particularly close. I think DK is going to be able to take care of business. And then Team Liquid versus GAM. Nice draw for Team Liquid. They're going to be very excited about this. This has been a team that has played really well in the early stages of games, but has been unable to close them out. Kind of the story of their whole year up until this point. That was the reason they got 7th in Spring Split, was because they would generate these massive leads even in the Spring Split, and they wouldn't be able to capitalize. In summer, it got a little bit better. They just got even better in the early game, but their late games have always been a problem. Still, Pioshik and APA, I think, are a great combo. Pioshik's on fire right now. He's playing really, really well. I think Core JJ is also playing at a really high level, and quite frankly, Team Liquid's just more talented than GAM. Now, that being said, there are a couple of matchups to watch out for. I think mid lane could potentially be in favor of GAM if APA plays like he did against Energy and gets run over by Kati. I'm not going to be entirely surprised. Kati's a really good player and somebody who is able to go up against a player like APA, I think, in terms of talent. Same thing in the top side. I know everybody loves Summit, but man, he makes a lot of mistakes in the late game, and Kiaya could just be a more valuable player towards what GAM wants to do. He's the best player in the VCS, a dominant top laner. Could be an interesting matchup, but in general, I think when you look at the talent level across the rest of the board, Team Liquid definitely outpaces them. I could see a world in which this series is close, but TL should be able to get the job done, and quite frankly, they should be able to do it in 2 games. I just wouldn't be surprised if GAM either takes a game or maybe even fully upsets them a little bit more than maybe some other analysts would tell you, but that's going to do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about Worlds every single day that there are games on this channel, and so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything happening from somebody who's watched all 4 of the major regions this entire year and can give you some more in-depth maybe analysis on where some of these teams are coming from, this is the place for it. If you liked this video, you're probably going to like a lot of the rest of them, so hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all